So, welcome to the Queensland Academy of Arts and Sciences webinar on the impact of climate change on the World Heritage values of the Wet Tropics. My name's Helene Marsh and I'm going to moderate the webinar. I'm an Emeritus Professor at James Cook University in Townsville, and I'm also the Vice President Regional Engagement for the Queensland Academy. Climate change is the most significant threat to the Wet Tropics World Heritage Area's outstanding universal values, and it's already causing declining biodiversity, particularly for cool adapted upland species. Rising temperatures, intense cyclones and altered water cycles are threatening to restrict habitats, increase the vulnerability to pests and cause potential ecosystem collapse. This webinar is going to discuss the challenges for North Queensland's precious natural and cultural heritage and what could be done to reduce the threats. The webinar is scheduled to last an hour and a half. Before I introduce the remaining panel members, I'd like to ask one of our panellists, Chrissy Grant, a proud Eastern Kuku, Yulanji and Mulal woman, to perform an acknowledgement to country. As one of the 4 founding members to establish the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on World Heritage, Chrissy is currently a co-chair of that forum and works with the UNESCO World Heritage Convention. Chrissy also chairs the Board of Directors for the Wet Tropics Management Authority, so I can think of no one more perfect to start us off with an acknowledgement to country. Thank you, Chrissy.
Thank you, Helene, and welcome to all my fellow panellists for this really important webinar that we are conducting today through the QAAS. First of all, I want to acknowledge the Darren people on whose country I live and work in Yeppoon, and Darren people are custodians for a lot of the Fitzroy Basin through to the coastline, and right opposite where I live is the country of the Wapabara peoples. And so it would be really good if we could all write in our chat where you're calling in from to see the diversity of the traditional owners and the peoples and where people are logging in from.
Panel members, first of all, Darren Crayn. Darren's the Managing Director of the Australian Tropical Herbarium at JCU in Cairns, and he's an expert on plant systematics and evolution and the impact of climate change on the World Heritage plants of the Wet Tropics. Next, I'll introduce Susan Laurance, and she's also at JCU in Cairns, and she's an expert on how global change impacts tropical rainforests. And she's not only worked in the Wet Tropics, but she's also worked in the Amazon. So that gives her a broader perspective of the problems. And then Brendan Mackey, and Brendan's director of the Griffith Climate Action Beacon at Griffith, and he's the review editor for the International Governmental Panel on Climate Change, and he's a part for the working group on impacts, vulnerability and adaptation. And he also is very active in research in the Wet Tropics, so he's very well qualified to talk. And the last person is Steve Williams, and Steve's an adjunct professor at JCU. He was at Townsville for many years, and he's now based in Brisbane. He's an expert in global change biology and tropical ecology. He's an inaugural chair of the IUCN Climate Change and Biodiversity Specialist Group and a recent chair of the Wet Tropics World Heritage Area Scientific Committee, and one of the earliest people to start measuring the impacts of climate change on the animals of the wet tropics. So he's been doing that for a long time. Thanks, Steve. So I'm going to ask Brendan to lead for the first topic, which is how will climate change alter the physical environments of the wet tropics? Over to you, Brendan.
Yeah, thanks, Elaine. And I'm going to focus on what it is the science is telling us about how the climate up in the wet tropics region is changing and is projected to change in the coming decades, at least the ones that remain in this century. People often ask me, well, how do we know what the current climate is and what projections are for future climate, and how accurate are they at a regional level, like in the wet tropics? Well, the good news is, from a scientific perspective, is that we now have a nationally coordinated network of researchers, Bureau of Meteorology and CSIRO, and a network of Australian universities, including in Queensland, the University of Queensland, who are all running what are called dynamically downscaled regional climate models. So these give us literally an order of magnitude better resolution of what's happening to our climate and how it's likely to change. So previously we were kind of limited to what we call kind of global scale models, which had a resolution of maybe 200 or 400 kilometers, right? But now we're able to get these projections at resolutions down to 4 to 10 kilometers. So this means that these models can start to capture the influence of whether you're on the coast, the impact of the massive mountains like Bartlett, Bellot and Kerr, and the kind of climatic differences you see as you go west onto the tablelands, etc. And I would just point everyone to I want to doff my cap to Dr. Ralph Tranzesco and his team, which is now located within the Queensland Treasury, and they've developed a tremendous decision support tool called Queensland Long. Well, it's called Long Paddock. It's a website. If you search for Long Paddock, and they've made available there all the data, all the spatial data. Oh, we got Chrissy back. That's good. All the spatial data and the projection at this improved spatial resolution, and they're freely available for everyone to access. So what are those data telling us? These latest data from the regionally scaled models. Well, it's very interesting. Of course, the major change and impact we're facing is temperature. We know that climate change is fundamentally about more heat being kept within the Earth system, and that's leading to two big changes. One we call increasing climate trends. So it's just getting warmer everywhere. The night temperatures are getting warmer, day temperatures are increasing. But with every increment of global warming, we also see an increase in the frequency and duration and severity of all extreme weather events, and that includes heat waves. Hot days are getting hotter, very hot days are getting hotter. A very hot day is classified as something over 35 degrees, and we're seeing more of them each year. A larger number of days each summer are going to be over 35 degrees. And then when we have a heat wave event, which is extreme heat for a period of time, the actual heat is the heat waves are getting longer and more severe. This, of course, is very obvious in the Great Barrier Reef because of the direct impact that marine heat waves have on coral bleaching, etc. But there are impacts on terrestrial ecosystems as well. In terms of rainfall, rainfall's a much more complex phenomenon than temperature. So with climate change and temperature, everything's getting warmer and extreme heat's getting more severe. With rainfall, the projections are there's very little, there's not the same level of significant change in patterns of rainfall than what we've currently got. Except on the western edge, because as we know, the rainfall gradient drops off very quickly on the western edge. So we are going to see, if you like, an increased kind of aridity effect on the western edge. But in terms of the coast and the mountains, there are some shifts projected, but they're relatively small in absolute amounts, simply because rainfall, climate change affects rainfall very, very differently to how it affects temperature. So they're the third physical change I'll just mention, which is climate related, and that's sea level rise. The reason why the sea level is rising is because if you think about it, 3/4 of the Earth is ocean. So most of the extra heat from global warming is going into heating the oceans. And as you heat water, it expands. And also we're melting ice on land, and that's flowing into the ocean. Now, again, CSIRO have just released their latest sea level rise mapping, which is at quite a fine resolution for the entire Australian coast. And that's now available on a website called Coast Adapt, one word. It's a decision support platform to provide people with information about climate risks and adaptation strategies in the coastal zone. But you can go there and you can see, even in the wet tropics, you can see where along that coastline sea level is projected to cause inundation in the coming decades. And as you would expect, it's very much related to the geomorphology, right? The different geomorphologies are more exposed. So in a very general sense, Helen, that's a very kind of brief overview of what we're looking at.
Okay, thanks very much, Brendan. So you set the scene. And Steve, so you've been doing field work in this area for a very long time. What alerted you to the problem? How have the animal populations that you've monitored changed? And how confident are you that those changes are climate driven? Over to you, Steve.
Okay, thanks, Elaine. So yeah, I started off looking at climate change back in about 2003, and I had no intention of looking at climate change. I was a rainforest biologist, sort of happily looking at possums and frogs and things in the rainforest. And as a side project, we did some modelling on what the effect of increasing temperature would be. And it basically shocked me so much. Basically, most of the animals that I worked on were predicted to go extinct this century by those early models, which we published in 2003. So that kind of changed everything for me. And from 2004, I started doing a lot of systematic field work up and down all of the mountains across the whole wet tropics. So we collected data for another 6 or 7 years. And of course, the importance of looking across elevation is because as you go up the mountains, the temperature gets cooler. And that gives us an idea of how temperature is affecting all of these species. But it wasn't until about 2010, we had really increased our amount of information and we could do much more more sophisticated modeling. But again, even with all that increased data and coverage, it still showed that we were expecting a lot of declines, a lot of extinctions. Now keep in mind, that's just projections, it's predictions about the future. It wasn't until about 2015 that we started noticing that some of the species that we regularly saw at, say, about 600 metre elevation in the mountains, we were no longer seeing them. And then we noticed that at 800 metres, that these possums that we were spotlighting and the birds, we were starting to see them in less and less numbers. So that was when we first really started thinking that we were observing the impacts of climate change. And then in the subsequent years, up until about 2020, we did a lot of more work, more field work, and a lot of analysis about what was happening. And basically now, well, since about 2018, we had really good evidence that lots of species of birds, lots of species of mammals, especially the ringtail possums, had already significantly declined. It seems that the declines became sort of really noticeable after about 2014 when we look back through the data. Now we've got really good evidence to show that lots of the upland birds, lots of the upland mammals have really significantly declined. I'm talking like lost 60% of their total population already. So then, of course, we had to start thinking about what aspect of the climate was actually doing this. So we started looking in a lot more detail at the physiology of the species, exactly where they declined, exactly what type of species had already declined. And we started realizing, well, basically that the patterns that we'd predicted from 2003 and 2010 were basically coming true, pretty much exactly as predicted. Most of the species in those uplands were declining. When we looked at it in a lot more detail with a lot more information, we could start to tease out exactly what climate factors were causing those declines. And by far, increasing mean temperature was the biggest impact, but also the increase in the intensity of heat waves, as Brendan mentioned, and also a signature for the birds, particularly of an increased amount of rainfall in the uplands, which was related to decline in the uplands and an increase in the lowlands. Then we started realizing that it wasn't just things declining. The lowland species were actually moving up the mountains. And so, as you would predict with increasing temperature, the upland species, the cool adapted species, were declining and shrinking up the mountain, and the hot adapted species from the bottom were moving up to take their place. And so after that, we did more work looking at the really detailed mechanisms for that, and we realized that particularly with the possums, that it was linked to their physiology. It was a really complex story involving how they eat, how they digest, what type of soil they're on, the leaf chemistry, but basically everything still supported the fact that it was temperature driving those declines. So the best data we've got is on those possums and birds, and we're very confident that it is climate change driving those declines. We've also got sort of correlated evidence without as much long-term fieldwork that the same thing is happening to frogs, to beetles, to crayfish, to ants, and to plants. So it's a pretty grim picture overall. Thanks, Laurance.
Thanks, Steve, for those very sobering thoughts. Susan, you're a community ecologist. Can you explain to our audience what that means, and also what patterns you're seeing and how this is affecting invasive species as well? Thanks, Susan.
Okay, thanks, Helene. So I guess I'll start off and talk about rainforests. And we have seen similar patterns with rainforests, that mortality rates in forest plots, the 1 hectare tree plots that we study around the world, that the mortality rates have increased both in the wet tropics and elsewhere in the world. And so in the wet tropics, over the 50-year study of CSIRO plots, there's been a doubling in mortality rates. And that's in 2000 and in the early 2000s as well. I was studying mortality rates in the Amazon, and I'd observed there that mortality rates were increasing in intact rainforests up to 60% by 2010.
Can you just explain to the audience exactly what you mean by mortality rate? I think that might be helpful.
That's great. Yeah, thanks, Helene. So we study forests, we use this term forest dynamics, which explains both the number of trees. We start off with a plot and we measure all the trees in it. And then over time, when we remeasure those same trees, we calculate what proportion of the original trees have died, what proportion have grown. We want to know how much they're growing. And then how many new trees have arrived into that adult size class of 10 centimetres. And so from that, we're able to calculate over long periods of time the percentage of trees that die per year. And we track that over time. And it's very hard and very expensive work, and we track it over time. And we found in the wet tropics that there's been a doubling of mortality rates. And that's quite similar to what's been observed in the Amazon as well. And then globally, continental-wide in Australia, nationally, we've seen an increase in mortality rates across many major ecosystems and globally across the world. So it's a phenomenon that we have been observing. But here's the tricky bit. It's really unclear to know why trees die. That's understanding the causal factors is really difficult. Sometimes you can have a heat wave and you'll see trees immediately die. But in most cases, we see death can be a really prolonged process. So we have these climate associations that we think are increasing this tree mortality. And it's generally what a lot of people are associating, is hotter droughts. And those droughts can be two types of drought. They can actually be inadequate rainfall, or it's this new phenomenon that we've really been focusing on, which is an atmospheric drought. And so the fact that the atmosphere, as it gets hotter, has a much stronger drying effect. And we think this is extremely important globally on plant ecosystems. And then I just would say one more thing about that. So that's called vapor pressure deficit, is the term people use to understand that. Interestingly, in the wet tropics, if I was going to step away from the drought death, we've also recently had a new phenomenon with Cyclone Jasper. Like, that was 2 years ago. And, you know, I spent most of my life living in the cyclone belt. So we've always been so focused on high category cyclones. But Cyclone Jasper in 2023, it was only a category 2. You know, it's barely takes the leaves off the trees. It doesn't knock trees down. So it was not something that we were really concerned about. But it sat over the wet tropics for a really long period, for a couple of weeks. And some places got up to 2 meters of rain in that period. And we have, like, north of the Daintree, thousands of landslides. So in addition to, you know, all this work and all this focus that we've had on droughts and tree death around the world, now we have this new phenomenon of too much rain. And then I guess one other point, if I was going to raise, of plant communities to be concerned about, because Brendan brought up rising sea levels. And so we have the lowland rainforests are endangered, you know, in the wet tropics, and it's an endangered ecosystem. And the rising sea level puts at risk those beautiful little palm swamps that just sit really in that low-lying area. So we get salt inundation in them, and that's just going to be devastating for those sites.
Okay, I also asked you about invasive species.
Okay, I'll just go to invasives. Well, very quick. So in invasive, I'm not so concerned about invasives per se. From a plant perspective, I think, though, the big thing that we've been seeing in the drought experiment, which I've got behind here, has been the interaction between drought and insect attack. And so that's been something across the world. They've found that drought-affected forests are much more prone to mortality from beetle attack. And we've also got these new beetles in Western Australia that are really affecting these ambrosia beetles that bring in a fungus when they attack trees. And one of the things we've seen in the drought experiment is an increase in wood boring and termite attack of our trees. So the causal factor of why trees die, we suspect, is likely very synergistic with a lot of the biotic interactions that happen in forests.
Thanks, Susan.
Can I actually add something to that?
Yeah, please. This is exactly what we want you to do.
It was just interesting that Susan mentioned the interaction between the beetles, because I had a PhD student who worked in South Australia, but he was working on the wet tropics, and he was doing some very complicated network modeling, which was basically looking at the effect of all of the interactions in a really complex system in the rainforest. And what he did was try to look at, some way of looking at all the interactions between plants and beetles and frogs and possums and all of the different, parts of the rainforest. And the scary bit of what came out of that entire PhD was the fact that the predictions were that the extinctions caused or potentially going to be caused by the loss of those biotic interactions was greater than the predictions for the direct loss of biodiversity due to the direct impacts of climate change. And so the stuff that I spoke about earlier, where all of these things have declined so much already, is the direct impacts. And what that study suggested is that was actually not going to be as bad as the loss of those interactions. And that's a really scary thought to me.
And are people studying, that guy did modelling from what you said. Are people actually measuring those interactions, Steve?
Not in great detail. It's so incredibly complex. The way that he had to do it was to try to build, he had thousands of species, and then for all of these species, he tried to sort of at least link the things that were important to it. He'd link it to a plant, to another predator, to something they ate. And it was incredibly complicated. And so he had to run like many simulations. But the overall sort of take-home message was that those indirect effects could be really serious. And but it's so incredibly complex to look at in a tropical rainforest. There are so many interactions that we don't even know about.
So thanks very much. I now want to go to Darren. So Darren is an evolutionary biologist. So I want to know, can some of these species, probably not the long-lived ones, but the short-lived species, will they be able to evolve quickly enough to get the adaptations that will enable them to survive these incredible changes that we're seeing?
That's the million-dollar question, Helene. And I guess what you've picked up there is one of the ways in which ecosystems can respond to climate change. Individual species may be able to just stay where they are and tolerate the changes. I think that's probably unlikely for many of them, given the rate of change. Species may be able to migrate. They'll be able to move to an area that is more favourable and sort of track that climate. And I guess what Steve was observing with his long-term field-based studies was how the vertebrates are migrating upslope as it's getting warmer, lower and lower. And the other way is to evolve in the sense of to mutate, and for some of those mutations to be adaptive to novel climates, to new climates, and for those mutations then to become fixed in the population, so that over time you get the population having a greater tolerance to a temperature increase or a change in water availability or any of those sorts of things. But what you need for evolution to occur is a mutation, and then away from mutation to become fixed in the population. And that takes time. And it depends on two things in great part. One is how long an individual species takes to get to reproductive maturity. So from germination or from birth, how long does it take for that species or members of that species to then become reproductive themselves? So that's what we call the generation time. And for some animals, and certainly for insects, it's very, very short on the scale of less than a year or a few years. But for most plants, that generation time, particularly plants growing up in these relatively stable, cool climates on the mountaintops in the wet tropics, those generation times might be decades. So that means the opportunity for genetic novelty to arise through the birth of new individuals with different genotypes, that takes place over a very long cycle, which means evolution should proceed much more slowly in those long-lived plants with long generation times. On the other hand, there's there's not a lot of habitat on these mountaintops. The mountaintops are pointy. And if you look at the area, the total area up there for these populations to exist in, it's actually really, really small. So the population sizes, the number of individuals in these populations on these mountaintops is very small. And what that does is that means that new mutations, adaptations, become common in the population quite quickly. So you've got these two competing things. The short answer is I've no idea, Helene, and I don't think anyone really has any idea exactly how it's going to run. But the point I would make is that we kind of need to take the precautionary principle here. Every species is different. And as Steve pointed out, it's probably going to be the interactions that really, really matter. And that's terrifying to me, that what Steve had just said about the interactions potentially being the greater engine of extinction than individual species' lack of tolerance to change. Because, plants are critically dependent usually on species interactions for reproduction. So plants need to be pollinated, or at least the flowering plants need to be, which are the great bulk of the species of plants in the rainforests, need to be pollinated, usually by insects, but sometimes by bees, by birds, but also by bats and other kinds of arboreal mammals as well. And if those other species are changing in ways which means they're no longer available to provide the services to the plants that they need to reproduce, then we've got a recipe for a catastrophic breakdown. So in short, I think for most species, I don't think they'll be able to adapt quickly enough in terms of generating genetic novelty, which is adaptive. But perhaps that's not the critical issue. The critical issue is they may not even be able to reproduce at all because of the species.
Well, that's pretty grim. So now we'll go to Chrissy and ask her to explain to us what all these ecological changes, many of them drastic, how they're going to affect the indigenous values and the knowledge systems of the indigenous peoples of the wet tropics. Over to you, Chrissy. You're on mute, Chrissy.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Apologies, I'm having all sorts of problems with my computer, so I've gone to my fold-out phone. But yes, thanks for the question, and thanks for the previous panellists. And as we all know, the Wet Tropics World Heritage Area is listed only for its natural values. But it also is a living cultural landscape, and the cultural values was listed in the National Heritage Register for those important cultural values. Rainforest Aboriginal people have cared for these environments for millennia through sophisticated cultural knowledge systems, governance and custodian practices that are inseparable from the health of the country. So today we have more than 20 Aboriginal groups who continue to live, work and care for country within the World Heritage Areas. However, with the continued decline of the values through the climate change, there is a risk of loss of Indigenous knowledge. So we've got plant and animal species of significance for the traditional owners who are, sort of quite very often lost or already in the threatened species, category. And so the challenge before us is no longer whether wet tropics will change, but whether governments, communities and traditional owners can act quickly enough to strengthen resilience, restore connectivity, and support adaptation while there is still time to protect the values for which the wet tropics was internationally recognised. And I know that there's a question further on about, sort of the impact on the species and that, but a lot of those species are totem species for, the different nations of people, different clans within those nations, and even different family groups in those nations. So it is really important that, sort of the impacts are minimised as much as they could be in, sort of looking at, some of how climate change might be able to make an impact in a different direction of actually, sort of caring for country in the way that Indigenous peoples have been caring for country through fire management and land practices. And so that, is hopefully some way of not losing some of those species of significance to, the rainforest Aboriginal peoples. So, sort of climate change is the biggest threat to the World Heritage Area and those values. And as you said before, Helene, sort of and maybe Susan has said it as well, increased temperatures, intense cyclones and, altered patterns. And we're going through that quite a bit with landslides up in the Daintree region, which is my home country. Flooding, drought, wildfire and invasive species are really making an impact to the condition of the ecosystems that evolve in relatively stable climatic conditions. So I think it's really important and crucial that the Indigenous peoples are part of the solution and not sort of just consulted with later about how, we might be able to reverse this dilemma that we're facing now with climate change. And I think, sort of do it with Indigenous peoples rather than, sort of come back to us later. So the practices have been there for, they've been there for 65,000 years. And so they would have come across, sort of these different times of, sort of climate changes. And so, sort of what we don't want to see in our lifetime is, sort of the loss of any more species that are home, that makes the wet tropics home for them, and found nowhere else in the world sometimes. So I think it's crucial that sort of Indigenous peoples have not impact, but have engaged enough to be able to help with the solution.
Thanks very much, Chrissy. Actually, I think we can segue back to Darren, because what I'm going to ask him is very important for your people to have a say about as well. So, Darren, you talked about species living at the pointy end of the high country in the wet tropics, going extinct or no longer being able to breed. What choices are there, or what opportunities for translocation, moving survival populations both within the wet tropics or somewhere else? And so let's start. What would be the ecological limits for that, and then maybe we can get on and talk about both the ethical and cultural limits. So let's start with your expertise as an evolutionary biologist and what's possible.
Again, a very good question. I think the point I'd initially make is science knows very little about the biology of the great bulk of the species that we're talking about here that occupy the wet tropics. And as Chrissy said, many of them, a very high proportion, are found nowhere else in the world. And we live in a wealthy country with a long history of support for science and scientific investigation. So in terms of it being a tropical nation with tropical rainforest, we're about as best placed as anybody is to know our own tropical rainforest well. Yet, tropical rainforests are so incredibly complex that we still have virtually no knowledge of the biology of the majority of the species. So with that, any considerations about how we intervene in nature, such as taking species off country and placing them somewhere else in the hope that that mitigates against extinction, is something that should be done incredibly carefully and with great humility, because we really don't know what will happen for the great majority of them. We don't even know what their requirements are. For plants, which I know a lot better than animals, it's not uncommon across the country and across the world for plants to be translocated to other places if they're likely to go extinct in situ or if they get in the way of bulldozers. So there are fairly well-established approaches, very well-practiced approaches for plant translocation, but in practice, it rarely works over the long term. You may be able to establish plants somewhere else in habitat. I'm talking about establishing them in another piece of similar habitat as opposed to keeping them in botanic gardens. So when we're establishing or translocating to another piece of suitable habitat, over the long term, that rarely works for plants. And I don't know anything about the animals. But that's just the mechanistic aspect of the translocation, whether or not it actually works for sustaining living populations. But there are a whole lot of other considerations, of course, and one of those is, should we do it? Are we taking plants off country that are meaningful for people? When we move them, we're not moving their ecosystems with them. We're not moving their mycorrhizal fungi that form associations with their roots and are critical to them being able to sequester nutrients from the soil. We're not taking their pollinators with them. We're not taking all of the other things that form part of their ecosystem of interactions. So I would regard it as a last resort, I think.
Okay, thank you. Well, that's the plants, and at least they mainly stay still after they're moved. But what about some of the more mobile species that have huge ranges compared with many short-range plants? Steve?
Yeah, I mean, translocation is such a complex issue, and of course, all of us who have been trained as conservation biologists have always learnt our whole career that moving things around has always been, full of danger, and it shouldn't be done. Saying that, I think we need to also think about the fact that there's all sorts of different types of translocations. A lot of the things that we've thought about in the wet tropics are not maybe as bad as we think in terms of moving stuff around, and by that I mean moving just individuals from one population where they're slightly better adapted to a warm environment, just moving the same species into a place that it already occurs, but moving individuals that are slightly better adapted for warm environments. And we've already got some evidence for that in things like blizzards, that it is a possibility. So the other thing is just moving species within the region. So we're not moving them to a new biogeographic region. We're not moving them into different habitats. We're just moving them into the same sort of rainforest, but potentially on a different mountain range where there's a better climate refugia. For example, moving things from a lower mountain into the rainforest at similar elevations on, say, Bellin and Kerr or the Carbine tablelands, where there's a greater range of cooler temperatures because they got more elevation. And so, there are different levels of translocation that we need to think about. And the other comment I'd have is that as much as I agree with Darren that it's our last resort, this thing that we hate to think we have to do, the trouble is we need to learn about how to do it now so that in the future, if we get desperate enough, we know actually how to do it, or what things are likely to work and what things are likely not to work. So I think it's something we really need to be studying now and hoping we never have to use it.
Thank you. Susan, do you want to add to that? And then I want to really ask a key question of Chrissy here. Susan,
I thought I'd add that there's a couple of, I completely agree with Steve that we have to try. We have to learn about the process. And so ongoing now in the wet tropics, we've got brush-tail bettongs being translocated, and we've got one of the waterfall frogs that's also been translocated to environments that people believe will be good for them. And that's a strategy to sort of not keep all your eggs in one basket, and just to sort of, and it is really frightening to do it because we don't know all the things that could go wrong, but if we don't try, then we're not going to learn all the things that could go wrong. So we've got to be trying now before it's too late.
Thanks, Susan. Chrissy, so you wear a couple of hats here. You're chair of the Wet Tropics Management Authority, so you, I guess, discuss these key, really demanding policy matters wearing that hat, but you're also a traditional owner, and you work closely and understand the other 20 or so traditional owner groups. How do traditional owners think about these things, and who decides what's okay?
Okay, there's a different, quite a different view from different traditional owners, particularly across the rainforest as well as up and down the reef, about translocation. The issue here for Indigenous peoples is that if it is a significant species, either plant or animal, and it is moved off country because of the dangers of losing it where it is, sort of that becomes a disconnect for them, and sort of the values and the knowledge itself is no longer available for them as the generations move on. So there are instances now that we know that our older people, sort of knew what was used for food and knew how to prepare it and use it. And so some of the species, particularly in the plant variety, is for food and or medicines that they've been practicing for, generations, thousands of years. And so, that gets completely lost as the younger people grow up, because they haven't got that connection either with the elders or with the plant or totem species and that themselves. For me in particular, my totem is the saltwater crocodile. And, sort of for it to, I hear a lot of discussion around, culling and things like that, but deep down it hurts to sort of know that that's what they want to do, and is to cut the numbers. And yes, it might be a pest, and I understand all of that, but, my inner feeling is that, sort of other people are going through this as well, as different insects and ecosystems and plants are being, not only destroyed, but sort of just through the impacts and effects of climate change, changing their, their position or sort of even becoming extinct. But yeah, translocation is a bit of an issue for traditional owners, and sometimes nature does its own thing. For the reef, for instance, just to use that as an example, I have heard, traditional owners say, well, you can't take our corals from up north here and plant it down further down south, whether it be central Queensland or even further south. But the tides will do, the currents will do that anyhow. But, sort of where man interferes, that's a different situation. And as the previous speakers have already said, it's sort of a difficult thing that we may have to do if we want to save a species. But I think if that's the case, well, then traditional owners need to be engaged and involved, and for them to fully understand that to continue the life of either that plant or animal, it is a necessary step that we may have to go through. But if they're involved, it may not cause as much harm and hurt as if they weren't involved in the whole process.
Thanks, Chrissy. I hope then that we are going to have to experiment, and there are going to have to be ways of meaningfully involving the traditional owners of the donor place and the recipient place can be worked out, because I think it's going to be really critical and very hard. And so I want to say that, Steve says we've got to learn, and that's going to be part of the learning, isn't it? How to do it in a way that's as acceptable as possible to traditional owners, and how they can be meaningfully involved.
Yes.
And I think another thing there that is relevant is that we're already seeing such severe declines in the animals, at least that we have information about. And we have to sort of think about it. The other way to look at it is, the risk of not doing something that we think is risky is potentially, outweighed by the risks that are already impacting those species. We have to balance that, the risk of doing something that we don't know enough about versus the risk of just sitting here and doing nothing and watching them go extinct. And it's a really tricky question.
They're all very tricky questions. So I'm going to ask each of you, and I'm going to start with Susan, but I'm going to go round. If you had to prioritise what you think would be the most effective actions that governments could take in the next 10 years, both within and beyond the wet tropics, to try and conserve the wet tropics World Heritage Area's outstanding universal values, what would they be? So you can pretend you're the minister or maybe the treasurer in charge of the money, and we'll start with you, Susan, and then move around. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you. I'm glad I start with an easy one. Well, one thing, I guess I'd start off and say long-term monitoring for me would still be a key priority, because we wouldn't know what we know today if we didn't have that long-term monitoring that Steve had done and that Cyro had done at these sites. So I think that's really critical. I think there's a lot of new technologies that are coming on board, which I would incorporate, which allow us to move from a single site more into the landscape. So using LiDAR and thermal drones, I think that's been really key for the spectacled flying fox. And that's been a program that we've actually been able to use with Indigenous rangers in the wet tropics. And then the second issue would be there's a real problem with the monitoring and how management actually can act on it. With national parks people themselves saying, look, we've got all this data, but we can't move. We don't know how to move quickly enough to make a management decision. So there's obviously a break there that needs help in making sure that data's making management work better.
Okay, they're yours. Brendan, you're advising government on this, and what would you say?
Thanks, Len. Well, I think that we really have to start empowering communities and local organisations more, and that includes First Nations, their corporations, but also their communities, and all the non-government organisations, land care groups, etc., and also the local governments in the region as well, to understand what the climate-related risks are that fall with what they are for where they live and work and that falls within their spheres of obligations or responsibilities. People need to understand what the adaptation options are, the feasibility of them, their social acceptance, their cultural appropriateness, and if they're an organisation, how they can start to develop their own adaptation resilience planning and integrate these into their strategic and operational planning that all organisations have to do. Queensland government, for example, has been funding a very good program for local governments, climate action program, but I've been told that funding isn't going to be replenished, so there's going to be a gap at the local government level. So I think we need to be putting a lot more resources into understanding what the risks are, understanding what the adaptations options are, and starting to operationalize them, starting to build them into as a matter of course into our strategic and operational planning. So that's, I think, the big gap at the moment.
Thank you. And what about you, Darren?
Thanks, Celine. Yeah, I agree with all of those things. I think from my perspective, if we could ramp up restoration of habitat, fundamentally, these species need a place to live. The more habitat we have for them that exists over a range of temperature and climate gradients, then the more possibilities and opportunities they have to migrate around and track the climate to the extent that they can, but also to potentially evolve in response. So connecting up isolated patches of rainforest, there have been programs in the wet tropics around this for a long time. They can always be done better. They can always be done quicker. There's also changes in land use that are underway in the wet tropics. And those changes in land use with the changes in the viability of certain industries, or certain primary industries, present opportunities to make land available for restoration. And we should focus on how that can be done meaningfully, supporting communities, as Brendan said, but with the restoration of biodiversity and the restoration of the potential for resilience and adaptation being the primary goal.
Okay, I'm going to let you have the last word again, Chrissy. Steve, what would your wish be?
Well, if the discussion is about what we should be doing to protect the values of the Wet Tropics World Heritage Area specifically, I'd say, number one, we already know where the best areas for protecting that biodiversity are, the climate refuge area in these mountains. We need to do everything we can to make sure that they are as resilient as possible. I agree with Darren that we need to restore areas that could be good refugia for the future, because there are areas of high elevation that have been cleared in the past, and to maintain those corridors. The other thing I'd like to repeat something that a friend of mine, Professor Leslie Hughes from Macquarie, who's been actively involved in climate change research for many years, that she used to always say that there are three things we need to do about protecting biodiversity from climate change, and they were mitigation, mitigation, and mitigation. Reducing emissions, attacking the root cause of the problem was really the main thing we need to do, and everything else is kind of fiddling at the edges a little bit to, do the best we can, but it's still just fiddling at the edges.
Okay, Chrissy, you're the chair of the Wet Tropics Management Authority. You presumably give advice to government at a pretty high level. What do you say?
Well, I think, there's a number of different things that need to happen, should happen and could happen. And that is, as Steve was saying, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also protect what we have already. And WETMA undertakes this role as a core business in limiting impacts of development on the area through, zoning and permitting systems, and this is done through the Wet Tropics World Heritage Protection and Management Act. And investing in the protection of, the corridors, as Steve has already said. And I think a lot of these things need to be done at the community and the local government level. And I think Brendan or Darren may have said that earlier. But, forming those partnerships with local communities and traditional owners is really important, to also have good governance around the work that they do, and some of the work for the traditional owners is the cultural burning, and recognising Indigenous knowledge as essential to the climate adaptation approaches. And, for myself, we've been working at this not only in the Wet Tropics, but also in the Great Barrier Reef, because I think we are so closely aligned to, what we can do together to complement each other in, the work that we do on land and at sea. So there's a lot happening for traditional owners up and down the Queensland coast, but also within the Wet Tropics World Heritage region. And they are building their capacity, their resources and their funding and their funding to actually manage some of these actions that they can do on the ground that is going to assist in, being able to have input into this, as I said before, the solutions of what really needs to be done.
Okay, thanks. Now I'm going to ask a quite contentious question, which some of you will know have been a topic of great interest to me for a long time. Not that I've ever got a satisfactory answer. So, as many people know, every year pretty well there's yet another controversy about whether the Great Barrier Reef should be listed as World Heritage in danger. And different people have different views. So far, Australia has resisted that to the hilt. It has been a lot less of a topic about whether the Wet Tropics or any of our other 21 World Heritage areas should be listed as in danger. All of you talked about things that need to be done that aren't yet being done enough. Do you think, and we'll start with you, Chrissy, then the others, would listing the Wet Tropics as World Heritage in danger be an effective lever for change, or would it have negative unintended consequences? What do you think?
An in danger listing could be a powerful signal that climate change is, already threatening globally significant ecosystems, and so, like the Barrier Reef, it might be able to attract funding that we don't currently have to do all that we need to do, and so that would be, one view. And I know that, if you were in the tourism industry, for instance, you would think that was a terrible thing to happen. And so, to attract political attention, and I don't really want to see that happen, to be threatened to be listed in the endangered listing, because it takes a long time for staff, the resources, the reporting, the missions that come out to do the inspections and assessments of, how far it's gone in the other way that we don't want it to be in, impacting on the outstanding universal values. And I know we don't have that type of, backup, if you like, to call on for now. So, yeah, it's something that I wouldn't like to see in a way. But the other positive probably is that it might increase political attention and therefore, pressure the state and Commonwealth governments to put more funding into it. And so, the last thing that we want is for the people to give up on the efforts of, adapting and becoming apathetic to the perceived inevitable decline of the values of the area. But it is really important that, we empower them. As I think Steve was saying, it's good to empower the community because then they feel they have part of that ownership of the World Heritage Area. And I know I've been to a number of different World Heritage areas where communities aren't involved, and I walk through and I think, well, why is this listed on the World Heritage list? Because it's the aesthetics aren't there. Nobody's actually managing the place, and sort of once upon a time it might have been really good, but if we don't keep it up, this is the sort of decline that we're going to have. Across any of the World Heritage properties that we have here in Australia, and it's not something that we are encouraging, but if it does happen, I think that it's an opportunity to actually do some things through funding, through resources, and through better management that we can do to help reverse the process.
Thanks, Chrissy. Brendan, what do you think? You've had a lot to do with international fora on these sorts of topics. What do you think?
Yeah, thanks. I think, what's controversial here, I think, or the controversy is how we have been interpreting what a World Heritage in Danger listing means. So typically what it has meant is that, as Chrissy was kind of, I guess, suggesting, there are places that are governments, the national government has not been properly managing the World Heritage Area. It's allowed degrading processes from inappropriate human land uses or development proposals to degrade, the outstanding universal values. So being listed on the World Heritage in Danger list, is seen as a matter of shame for a government, right? They're doing the wrong thing. But I don't think that's what we're talking about here. Of course, the root cause, as Steve pointed out, was climate change is being driven by greenhouse gas emissions from burning fossil fuel for energy of one kind or another, and from the emissions from deforestation and degradation. And it's a responsibility of the world community shares to reduce all those emissions in aggregate to what's called net zero. And so the climate change impacts we're talking about here are not they're our collective responsibility. So I think we just somehow need to reframe how we interpret what the World Heritage Danger listing means if the danger is due to global climate change. Now, so if we can, and so it's kind of a communication issue in a sense, but if we can do that, then I think there are two benefits from a listing, and I think it's basically what Chrissy said. We would be, and again, we've got the evidence based upon the research that Steve and his colleagues have done over many decades now. We have the evidence that if the property is being impacted, is going to be greatly impacted in the future, and we are going to see significant and irreversible loss and damage to aspects of the outstanding universal value. So I think that that does two things. One, it's more evidence that the world community needs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to limit global warming. And as Chrissy said, it should also flag that the Australian government needs to be providing, and the state governments need to be providing, significantly more resources, so that the kinds of interventions that we've been talking about on this panel today, the kind of interventions that could help species and ecosystems and communities, that the resources are there to enable that action to happen. So as long as we can deal with, I do think we've got a communications issue about explaining what it means, but I think, based upon what we've heard today and the scientific based projection for what's coming down the pipeline in the decades to come, that we should seriously think about this as an option. Thanks.
Okay, does anyone on the panel have a different view to that? Susan, what do you think? Or Steve? We'll start with Susan and go to Steve.
Yes, no. Well, I guess all I would say is I think the management of the Wet Tropics Management Authority is gold standard. So it's not a bureaucracy issue. It's not a public policy issue. They've been doing the best, some of the world leading in how they've addressed issues and tried to deal with them. I don't think that's the problem. But I think the discussion of listing the Great Barrier Reef has raised almost $1 billion just working in water quality in the wet tropics. But the focus has been just on water quality. So I think having the discussion would actually really help us initiate new programs.
Steve, what do you think?
Well, I'm not really sure about unintended consequences, sort of politically and policy-wise and everything. I agree with what Sue was saying, that I think Wet Tropics Management Authority do a fantastic job and the best that's possible with the resources they've got. I think it's also a little bit of a moot point, sort of saying whether or not we think it's in danger, because it already is in danger. It has already declined. We have the very things, the very species that it was declared a World Heritage Area to protect have already declined by sometimes more than 50% of their population. So, it's it's a bit of a moot point. It already is in danger. And I was always hoping that an official listing, like I've been pushing for several years now to try to get the uplands rainforest listed under the EPBC Act as an endangered ecosystem. And I always sort of hope that the outcome of that will be greater awareness, more research on the problem, and more resources, as Brendan was speaking. So, yeah, from the point of view of someone who spent their whole life wandering around in the rainforest, and because they love it so much, I think that listing it as in danger has got to get some more attention and hopefully get something done.
What do you think, Darren?
Yeah, look, I can concur with that point of view. I think all of the salient points have already been made, so I've got nothing significant to add. But I do agree with Steve. I think the impacts are already obvious and underway. To the extent that they're reversible, nobody really knows. The issue, of course, and I think Brendan put it very well, is this is a global. The mitigation is a global responsibility. So what does that actually mean for an individual property to be listed as in danger when the key measure that can be taken to reverse that is a global responsibility? And that's something I had never really thought through before. It's undeniable that an in danger listing would really put the cat amongst the pigeons politically, and very likely lead to some very significant mobilisation of resources currently unavailable to the wet tropics.
Okay, well, I'll tell you what I think as a moderator. I think it merits listing in danger. I think the threat of listing it as in danger might judging by the Great Barrier Reef, mobilise significant funding. The problem is that, and I know a fair bit about this because I used to be on the World Heritage Committee, is that there would be no way of ever getting it off the list. And actually a really high proportion of natural properties in the world are in danger from climate change. And so we would end up having this huge pile up of particularly natural properties that we're never going to get off a list. And then maybe that wouldn't have the desired effect of mobilising the world. So I think some of the key people who have called for the reef to be listed in danger have realised that actually the threat has been very effective indeed in terms of funding. I mean, if you look at the overall funding for nature conservation in Australia, a disproportionate amount goes to the barrier reef. It's extraordinary. So yes, the threat, but I'm not sure about the actuality. I'll just give our audience an opportunity while we continue talking about if they would like to ask any questions, please put them in the chat, and I will spend a few minutes answering two or three. And in the meantime, while you're thinking about that, Ashley, you can make it live so people can put their questions up if you like, please. I'm going to ask everyone, what do you think is the biggest misconception about climate change in the wet tropics? And I'm not meaning in terms of experts like yourself. I mean in thinking about, the public. What is it that they don't get that's the most serious thing, do you think? I don't care who starts. We'll start with you, Steve. You haven't started for a while.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things there. One is, I think it's really hard for a lot of people to understand how just 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees can make a difference to a system like the wet tropics. I mean, it's like, it is not intuitive because, it was 5 degrees hotter yesterday. So what's the big deal about, 1.5 degrees on average? And I think that is one misconception. That's a common misconception about climate change in general. The other thing in the wet tropics that I think is important, coming at it from my angle of looking at, the animals that are declining, is that there's that perception that the rainforest still looks the same. You go to any national park, it still looks the same. It still looks pretty good. It's all, nice canopy. It doesn't look unhealthy. So they're sort of, I think there's that conception that's like, oh no, I think it's like, it's fine. And so I think that kind of overcoming that that belief that everything is fine because what you just see, you can't notice any difference, is another big misconception.
Thanks very much. Brendan, as a physical scientist, what do you think is the biggest misconception? You're on mute, Brendan.
I'm also a forest ecologist, Helene, as well as a physical scientist. So,
okay, sorry.
That's okay. I mean, Steve's right on the 1.5 degree thing. The thing you've got to explain to people is that it's a index, right? It's the average. It's the change in the average annual daily surface temperature of the entire planet now compared to what it was in 1850. It's not actually a measure of the temperature, what the temperature is today. So it's more like the analogy I give is like with you go to the doctor and your GP takes your temperature with a thermometer is just an index of your state of health. So a healthy planetary temperature is 0, right? And we're currently at about 1.3. It's just a measure of how much additional heat energy is kept within the planetary system. And so every increment, i.e. 0.1 of a degree above in that index, represents a massive, massive amount of additional heat energy and a massive amount of climate change. So yeah, it's kind of unfortunate how that's been used. I spent a long time in Canberra, and people would rejoice to hear that winter's going to be 1.5 degrees warmer, but that's not what it means. The other thing that people get confused about is they assume that hotter means drier, and that's not the case. Of course, a warmer world is actually a wetter world, because as the atmosphere heats up, it can hold more water vapor, and what goes up has to go down. Hence, as Stephen was saying, we are seeing a change we're not seeing a change in overall rainfall, total rainfalls, but there is a change in intensities. Certain parts of the tropics are going to see more heavy rainfall days, for example, and more intense heavy rainfall days. I think just to add to what Stephen said, it's a difference between a lot of the outstanding universal value tourists can't see, right? Like, you can't see the evolution. You can't see the evolutionary tree. The evolutionary. You can't see the evolutionary significance of a plant per se, and our wildlife are very cryptic, and a lot of the animals Stephen's talking about are nocturnal. So the tourist experience, I'm just agreeing with what Stephen's saying, or amplifying a bit. The tourist experience is very different to the science, what the science is telling us about what's going on. And so that's part of the communication challenge again here.
Okay, we've got one question which I think we should, and this question from Scott Buchanan, and he said, is there a risk that governments are becoming wary of listing new areas as World Heritage due to the threat that climate change poses to properties? That might be one for you, Chrissy. You're very close to the international action now.
Yeah. So I think that I probably think something a little different, in that, sort of the number of World Heritage nominations that are going up. The governments have got to realise that they need to support that, and I don't think they put the support that's needed to some of the current World Heritage properties, let alone brand new ones. So I know that people are really interested to have their place assessed for different unique values and rare sort of conditions and that they have in the criteria. But sort of, for instance, we met with a small delegation of 2 people at the last World Heritage Committee meeting in Paris last year. And they want the Nullarbor, not the plains, but the underwater to be, where all the caves and systems are, and they want that to be listed. But, sort of they're not, at the moment, getting that sort of support from the government. And so if that was something that is rare and unique and, sort of meets the criteria and culturally is significant as well, sort of I think that resources and support has got to be there for the community, both the traditional owners of the area as well as the scientists that are involved in, looking at the criteria and the assessment of those criteria, the values against those criteria. And so that's my take on it. But I think that sort of, yes, they do need to realise that, sort of they're going to put these places on a very high level World Heritage listing. that they need to support it as well.
Okay, we're going to have to, you've got one final 30 seconds, each panel member. I'm going to go in alphabetical order and say, what's your take-home message that you'd like the audience to remember from this panel? And we start with you, Darren.
I would say there's still an awful lot more we need to learn about the wet tropics, about how ecosystems function and the entities that comprise them, to really know what the impacts of climate change would be or are.
Okay, I
But
might stop you there. Okay. Susan?
Darren took mine. I was just going to say that we're still learning about really big impacts that we hadn't predicted 15 years ago. You know, really global change, climate changes we're still learning about, and that's really surprising to me.
Brendan?
That there's a lot we can do to help people and nature deal with the climate change impacts that are happening and those that are projected, and we need to accept that and start resourcing it.
Steve?
I think everyone's already said what I was going to say, but I think really just to say that these things are happening right now and we really need to act now. It's not a future problem, it's a now problem that we need to start doing stuff.
And Chrissy?
Like Steve, I think a lot of it's been said, but I do think that if you want to get involved, please get involved in, sort of knowing what your World Heritage property has been listed for in your area, not only in your area, but across Australia as well. And somehow you may be able to help.
Okay, look, I'd like to thank our panellists. I think it's a very interesting discussion. Roland Sussex from the Queensland Academy says it's much worse than I realised. So I guess there's at least one person out there that's realised how serious the situation is. So I'd like to thank the panellists, I'd like to thank the audience very much and future audiences, and I'd like to thank Ashley Stewart and her staff as the managers of the QUT Centre for Data Science who put this on. Thank you, everyone.